This one's for you, Chickie. What's up, everybody? My name is Jacob Hardison, and today we're going to talk about Motorama. Welcome back, of course, to the lovely Adrenaline RC YouTube channel, where today we're going to be discussing Motorama. For those of you who don't know, Motorama is a pretty big event that is held here on the East Coast in the February timeframe, because of course we're in February and it was just held. And it is a fairly large electric race for, of course, the RC end of things. But then on top of that, they also have a ton of different events. They've got dirt bikes, they've got a few different car shows, quarter midgets, go-karts, RC drag racing, I believe. So they got a load of everything. But of course, I participated in the RC end of things because, well, we are an RC racing YouTube channel and I play with toy cars. So today, of course, I wanted to kind of give a bit of a recap of my experience with Motorama. We'll probably start out with just kind of my feeling on like the initial impressions of the track, and then we'll go into the actual racing end of things, kind of what my mindset was throughout the weekend. And then of course, I did get one video of me driving around the track, so I'll dabble that in somewhere. I promise I'll get better in the future, but we've made progress. I can actually show you guys me driving my toy car on the track. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started with today's video. So to jump straight into things here, of course, a Motorama track is built pretty much the day before the event actually starts, maybe 2 days before. I believe they get in like really early Thursday or like right midday Wednesday. Nonetheless, not a lot of time. So in the span of pretty much 48 hours, they have to build an entire A-scale track, have it piped, prepped, ready to go with the loop in, driver stand ready to go. And they've done that for many years now. So of course, thank you to the track crew that puts in all that time to get that ready for us. And then of course, thank you to the man, the myth, the legend, Scotty Ernst, for hosting the event effectively and getting us through the race program without any holdups at all. And of course, his lovely, great announcing. Always love hearing Scotty announce. To jump into the track end of things, the track this year definitely, when you first looked at it, seemed a little bit more open, a couple challenging spots, of course, but seemed like it should flow fairly well, not be something to necessarily have huge adaptations to. Of course, when we actually hit the track, we learned that that was definitely not the case. The track itself was very technical. The roller section in the front, and this is where I'll probably throw in a little bit of that footage just so that way you guys can get an idea, or I'll throw in a picture of the track, something like that. But the diagonal 5-pack roller on face value doesn't look like it would be anything super duper crazy to get through, but when you're coming out of the giant Talladega, Daytona turn, whatever you prefer to call it, the big bank turn, and you're flying through there, it's very easy to get the car upset and not be super duper happy. So definitely, just in that section alone, provided a lot more challenge than I think what was initially expected. Then as you came around the track, the next kind of short shoot double section, that was fairly straightforward, nothing crazy there. And then directly in front of the driver's stand, there was a double, which kinda could be made here and there. It seemed like that if you were making it, it was kind of like right on the downside, but there wasn't a whole lot of lip on that double. So sometimes, you kind of clip the rear end, but it was nothing that super duper upset the car. The really, I don't know if I want to say the most tricky section of the track, but the most option line section of the track was the left side single, double, single. There's a ton of different options there. You could actually, even if you were skilled enough, there's a video of Ryan Lutz driving around where he actually jumped the corner tabletop, downsided it, which I think was one of very few to even happen during the weekend, and then was able to do a double out and then a single at the very end. The most traditional line that everybody took, though, was to take that inside line, drop down off the tabletop, do a double, and then single out of it, which seemed to be pretty solid. Then after that, you of course went to the mega drop tabletop, is what I'm gonna call it, which was almost like a 90-degree, just straight down towards the ground. So you had to be very careful there. Make sure you didn't grab too much throttle to where you were kind of like jumping off of it. You always wanted to stay right on that downside so you could get a nice shoot off. But then of course you also had to keep enough speed to where your nose of the buggy or truggy doesn't actually dip in and dig into the dirt, so you could keep flowing. The hardest section to perceive on the track is where we're gonna get into next, which is gonna be the split lane, of which I think the idea of split lane is cool, but I feel like that each year they've done it, it's always definitely leaned more one way or the other. Over the course of the past couple years, they'll make little adjustments during the race weekend, but even then, it does seem like it always favors one over the other. And in this case, the A line, which was the further line from the driver's stand, was the preferred faster line. And it was definitely something that took a little bit, at least for me, to kind of learn and get into, because I couldn't really perceive where my car was on track. So it took me a minute to actually figure out, oh yeah, you know, I can full throttle through here and not have any major issues at all. But I definitely took my time kind of building up into that. Cost me a little bit of lap time at the start of the weekend, but I also didn't want to break my car or sacrifice track time, because there is a limited amount of track time you get on the track with this particular event. So I was trying to maximize that as much as possible, while also keeping it consistent, learning and getting faster around the track. After you came through the option line, the very, very end of it was a 180 into a skip double. Nothing super crazy there. You just had to make sure you didn't hammer the throttle too hard over that skip, or else you didn't really have a whole lot of space to actually do the double. The double wasn't massive, but if you kind of full sent into it, the car would start to get a little bit upset. But that was probably the most straightforward, easy section of the track in the grand scheme of things, because then you get into the massive, ginormous double tabletop thing in the back of the track, which took another kind of oddball line. Usually you'd want to stick right tight into the pipe, whereas in this case you did have to go wide. That way you can make the full double. Truck, definitely those guys, well, those guys, myself also included, was able to make the big double relatively straightforward. You could pretty much get on the downside. Buggy was a little bit more finicky. You definitely had to make sure you were lined up a little bit better so you could get the run up. And I feel like the majority of buggies were definitely landing more on top and then kind of sending off into the Talladega Daytona big giant bank turn, which then of course brought you back to the front of the track. So like I said, I am gonna put some clips and layout stuff in there during that. That way you guys know what parts of the track I'm talking about, and then you have a pretty solid reference. Now, to get into the actual racing end of things, day one on Friday was a very busy day in the grand scheme of things. We were on track with each vehicle 4 times. We had a practice round, 2 seating rounds, and then of course, qualifier round number 1. So for the practice, of course, there was nothing super on the line for that. It was just practice. And then the 2 seating rounds took your top 2 consecutive, which then took your best of those 2 rounds and seeded you into the first and second qualifier. Second qualifier, of course, being on Saturday. Now, for me personally, because actually, you know what? I'm even gonna take another step back. You probably aren't expecting to see this here. We'll get more into this in a later video, but this is an RC8 B4.1E that was built by my lovely buddy, Mr. Lee Setzer. So I did have a slight swap up, but we did keep with the Techno Truggy for the weekend. But now to get back into the practice and seating end of things, I definitely took my time through that to, again, like I was saying before, maximize my track time, not have any breakages or major incidents, because of course you do have a limited amount. So for the first couple runs, my main focus was just to get a general idea for the track, kind of feel things out. For Truggy, I did show up with a little bit more of an aggressive setup than I think I should have. I think for somebody like Ryan Mayfield, it was perfectly fine, but for me, little old novice me, I definitely was not able to hang on to it nearly as well. So I made a couple of toe changes in the back, and then I went quite a bit heavier on my diffs, took out some chassis braces, and that seemed to help out a lot. But again, through those practices, my main goal was to just learn the track, figure out the cars, kind of see where I can make improvements around the track, and kind of just work from there. Throughout the first practice and the seating round, I went out on some green reflexes, nothing super crazy at all, just standard glued up tires for buggy. And then on Truggy, I do traditionally glue all of my green tires, just so that way the tire doesn't get ultra super duper inflated as it's going around the track, because it is a pretty big tire, so it's easy to get that kind of pizza cut effect. Now, throughout the first practice for buggy, That was a little bit more difficult, and actually through practice and the 2 seating rounds, because it was a randomly generated field, it was a little bit more on the difficult side to actually find space on the track to be able to learn. It seemed like that I would do one good lap, get into a groove, run out of traffic, and that was pretty much what happened through the first practice and first seating. Thankfully, I was still able to learn the track a little bit, but I didn't make any setup changes through those. I was, of course, just trying to figure out the track and trying to figure out space. That way, going into the second seating round, I could hopefully get my 2 laps in, because the first practice and first seating definitely were not spectacular. The car had the pace, but I just wasn't able to get 2 laps in a row between myself making little mistakes and then running into traffic. Truck, though, did go a little bit nicer, even though the car was more on the finicky side with that less rear toe, a little bit more anti-squat. I was still able to get some good laps in. I was able to learn the track very well and still seed myself fairly high up on each of them, because after each round, you can go back, live RC, see where you stack up overall. So luckily, even with my slight dismays, I still had fairly good practice and seating runs. Buggy, I did start out with an 11 in practice 1, then a 10, and then in seating round 2, I was able to get the car in a happy spot on the track without a bunch of other people. And I went out on green relapses for that one, and then ended up getting P7, which was good enough to, of course, make the A main heat as we got into qualifying. Truggy was more on the consistent side. I had a 9 in practice 1, a 9 in seating 1, and then for seating round 2, I was able to get a 7 for this, which then, of course, also allowed me to be inside that A heat, which was the #1 goal. At the end of the day, for practice, getting the full run in definitely isn't super duper important. Your main goal is to just get those 2 laps in. That way you can get into a good qual run and then kind of work from there over the weekend. So that is my practice and seating, just learning the cars, made a couple setup changes on this, and then just finding space on my buggy runs. Swapping into qualifier round #1, which was, of course, Friday night, the very last thing we did, the first 5-minute run of the weekend, and then, of course, the first official full laps and time run. And this was a qual points format, so I'm going to give qual points setups here for each of these. For qual 1, I took my normal route of I didn't want to necessarily push the car super hard. My main goal was to just have a clean, consistent run, get a good baseline for the weekend, because, of course, it is qual points, and with 4 rounds of qualifying, I didn't want to take the risk of dropping out of that A heat. I always wanted to make sure that I was still in that top level. That way I could always have the cleanest, fastest track, which, of course, I was able to do. Q1 for this, I was able to do a P6, I believe. And then Q1 for Truggy. Truggy, same thing. I wasn't worried about pushing the car super hard. I mostly just wanted to get a full clean run in. You'll see that in the video that I put out with me running the buggy. You'll see that other cars are definitely pushing a lot harder, but I feel like that it's always good to start off the weekend with a good solid run. Because if you start the weekend off with a bad run, or even if it's not a bad run, but a low qualifying run, it's kind of hard to keep yourself in the right mental state to be able to keep pushing throughout the rest, because you're kind of already setting yourself on a damper and you feel like you're on the back foot. And that is definitely not the goal in the grand scheme of things. My goal is to always just start off on the right foot, get some clean runs in. That way I can do my testing a little bit later on throughout qualifying, which I'll get into, of course, here in just a minute. So Q1, again, I was able to do a 6 in this, and I did an 8 in this. So 2 solid top 10 runs, which was my main goal. Going into Q2, which is now going to be which is now on Saturday. So we're swapping from Friday to Saturday. So this is the first run of Saturday. We get no practice on Saturday, just jumping in straight up cold turkey. And because of that same reason, I went into it again with just trying to get consistent runs. I wasn't worried about necessarily ripping the car super hard. I just wanted to get another top 10 run in for both. That way I could feel a little bit safer going into 3 and 4 with the satisfaction of knowing that most likely there's not a huge chance of me dropping out because I've got my 2 good runs in. And then kind of over the rest of the quals on Saturday, I could focus a little bit more on continuing to kind of dial in the cars a little bit more and try and push the cars a little bit more throughout. So for qualifier round 2, just another safe, consistent run. Same thing, green reflexes for both as we started the day off with on Friday. The reflex just, again, was a good, solid tire to go with. It's always a good option. It's always going to be consistent. It's always going to be safe. You usually don't have a whole lot of risk with that. And now that I've gotten 2 good runs in, I was able to go into 3 and 4 and kind of learn a little bit more of pushing the vehicles. So for Q2 on those green reflexes for buggy, I was able to do a 7. So at this point I had a 6 and a 7. And then for buggy, I went P5 for the round. So then I had an 8 and a 5. So that gave me those super good, consistent runs. That way I knew there was a pretty slim chance that I was going to get bumped out into a lower main. I could then at this point just kind of drive a little bit more freely. Going into qualifiers round 3 and 4, that is exactly what I did. I made a shock change on the rear of my truggy. That way I could try and get a little bit more side-to-side grip. That was a complete and utter epic failure. Definitely did not go well at all. I think that was my lowest run of the whole weekend. I think that was a 15. So I learned very quickly that this truck definitely prefers to have the shock on that inside mounting hole on the rear arm, and that made it drive way, way better as I swapped it back going into round 4. But at this point, even though that was my worst run of the weekend, I wasn't super worried about it because I knew that on the back end, I had that 8 and 5 to fall on. So even if Q4 went terribly, I knew, again, with 13 points, it was going to be pretty slim I got kicked out of the A final, whether it be starting towards the front or towards the back. I wasn't really worried about that. I mostly just want to make sure that I was able to get into it. For buggy rounds 3 and 4, I definitely tried to drive a little bit more aggressive. The track got quite a bit bumpier in that Q3 area. Usually the track gets that really dry bumpiness going into main day. So it happened a little bit earlier. So the buggies definitely were getting slightly more tossed around. Truggies, of course, with the bumpy track, they don't feel it nearly as much. But the buggies being a little bit smaller, not as much suspension, you definitely have to drive a little bit more smart. And if you watch throughout the weekend, even some of the super duper top guys, I don't think anybody in Q3 or Q4 actually had a full clean run. There might have been 1 or 2 that squeaked by for the full run that was going very quickly. But for the most part, I believe everybody made at least 1 mistake. And then of course, because I had my 2 good buggy runs in already, I did decide to push a little bit more at this point. That way I could try and get a little bit extra pace. Try to come off the drop down tabletop a little bit more aggressively, whole throttle a little bit more through that A-B line, of which for the most part it worked, but I did misjudge that A-B line one time, rolled the car over, and I believe I ended up with a 10 for the round on that. So again, not a great Q3 overall for buggy or for truggy, but I had those first 2 rounds to go based on. That way I was already pretty much safe. Going into Q4, we'll go back to our truggy here. I did swap to a green relapse for this run, which was a very good option going into the final round. It was probably the best my truck felt all weekend. I was able to rip it pretty hard around the track, now with these shocks back in the correct location and kind of learning more of the driving style of the truck. And for that one, I was able to have a very, very solid P5 for the round. And as we're going through this, I'll throw the results up on the screen as we're going over each qualifier. That way you guys can see where I stacked up and where my paces were. So my best run of the weekend definitely was Q4 of truck. I was able to rip it super hard. The car felt really consistent. It felt really easy to drive. And then of course, obviously that resulted in a P5, which says that that was in fact the case. So I was very, very happy with that swap in the truck. So then for buggy going into that Q4, I also swapped to the green relapse for that. And same thing for that run. I had a pretty solid run starting out. I was driving around with, I believe it was Greg Harmer, and I want to say Ethan was the other one. Ethan Mechanic was the other one I was with. We were in kind of a trio driving around the track, kind of keeping everybody on pace. So we were all having very solid runs there. And then unfortunately, while we were all in that train, a car wrecked in front of us. Marsh went out on track, and it was in the most terrible spot to have it happen, which was in that drop down tabletop. I lost my car completely, and the moment I lost visual of my car, knowing that there were 2 cars behind me that were, all pacing together, I yelled on the driver's stand, "Hey, I can't see my car." That way, of course, they would know. Unfortunately, we all came down the hill. We all, I think, lost our cars, grabbed the throttle, and then it was just total calamity. We all got together, stuck on the pipe. I think we were mostly able to get out without having to worry about marshals, but it was definitely not the greatest way to end off the qualifying weekend. So that was another 10 for truck. So I did stick with my 6 and 7. And then, like I was saying, for truck, for buggy. For my truck, I was able to do with that 5, like I was saying before. So I was able to have a 5 and a 5 for truck over the course of the 4 qualifiers. So overall, I qualified buggy in P9, and truck overall, I was P7, which I was very, very happy with. My main goal going into the weekend, being that I haven't raced really since Motorama last year, was to just make the AAA mains. So I was very, very happy at the end of qualifying day to make both of those mains, and I was pretty pumped going into main days. So I'll throw up on screen the overall qualifying and how the grid was set going into main day. And then, of course, we'll talk about the mains. All right, so main day. What a lovely day. What a lovely, lovely day. Truthfully, it wasn't terrible, but in the grand scheme of things, definitely not what I was hoping for, but also not super far-fetched from what I was expecting. So with qualifying, obviously you guys know my qual numbers and how those went, and I was able to have very, very clean runs pretty much throughout all of that. Main day, with everybody starting together, it's definitely a little bit more bump and grind than what I would have preferred. But as everybody was starting together, things definitely got a little bit more on the rough side throughout the day. A main number 1 was definitely mostly on me. So as I was saying before, for Q4, we did go out on a green relapse, which felt very, very good in both cars. Came back the next day, and for whatever reason, the relapse was just not the tire anymore. I thought for sure that once we swapped over to it, that was going to be just the tire for the entire main day. So I ran it on both my buggy and my truck. I said that backwards, buggy and my truck. And it almost felt like whatever grip the relapse had the night before, it almost had like inverted grip going the next day. The track didn't look super different, but whatever happened overnight, it was a total 180 difference. So A1 for both was definitely a little bit of a throwaway. Truck without the grip, especially coming out of that super high speed Talladega into the 5 roller, it got super sideways a lot and was definitely not a great run. For buggy went a little bit better, still not the most spectacular. I had a couple of my own bobbles. So for buggy, I ended up with a 10 in A1. So I guess I really only lost 1 spot. So not terrible for buggy. Truck though, I'm looking down at my notes here. Truck, I went from P7 at the start to finishing P11, which honestly, I wasn't surprised about it a lot. The vehicles, like I said, for whatever reason, the grip just totally changed. So going into the second main, I swapped back to a set of green reflex for both that were a 1-run set. Both had glued foam, so that way the tire was a little bit more stable. And I definitely had better runs in that. Truck, I was having a really solid run, and unfortunately, I got hit. That seemed to be the common theme of main day, but you know, that is what it is. It's race and it's off-road race, and I completed my main goal, which was to just make the main. But for truck, it did really suck because I felt like I had a pretty solid chance of even improving that P7 that I qualified for. But unfortunately, it is what it is. Still an okay run. I did have an 8 for A2, so not terrible. Was able to still have, you know, a pretty solid overall go at it. Before A2 of buggy, I feel like the overall driving wasn't the most terrible. Unfortunately though, I did get caught up in an incident early on. There was a driver that had just an electronic issue, nothing that he could have really controlled, but unfortunately I got caught up in that, which dropped me down, and then I just wasn't able to make the recovery back to the front. That was probably one of the better overall mains from a racing point of view. So unfortunately, between my mistake and then everybody kind of having an overall better run comparatively speaking, I was definitely left on the back foot, and unfortunately only had a 12 for that run. So as you can tell, so far for main day, definitely not the most ideal. Driving alone, you can definitely get some good runs in, but driving around, you know, amongst other people, definitely a little bit more difficult. Definitely, as I said in my tips video, you know, you got to be very, very aware of those around you in the grand scheme of things. Going into the final main, I definitely was probably not in the greatest headspace at this point, being that the first mains just didn't go the most spectacular. And well, going into the final main of the day, truck had my best main run there. The truck, I went out on a brand new set of green reflex, which we've learned after the race was a little bit too soft of a tire. Definitely the track seemed like it wanted more of the blue, but being that it was a brand new tire, it wasn't the most terrible by any means. Had a couple of twitchy spots here and there. The tires definitely got warm, but again, being that it was a brand new tire with a glued foam, for the most part, stayed stable the entire run. Overall, I felt like it was pretty solid, and even despite having the issues earlier in the day, I was able to end off really strong with a P7 in this, and I was even able to end off that third main with a hot lap of the race. I think I had a 26.4, and the next closest hot lap was 26.7, so not quite finishing up high in the field, but at least I was able to take away a little something to make myself feel a little bit better as we ended off the weekend. So I did feel good ending off truck with that. Truck felt really fast, and I definitely brought my mood up a little bit more. Then going into the final run of the entire weekend with e-buggy, I also had an electrical problem, which was funky. As I was walking up onto the driver's stand, my buggy decided it was just going to totally spaz out and do whatever it wanted. So we turned it off, turned it back on, and it seemed happy. So we decided to throw it on track and see what would happen. For buggy in A3, I went out onto the green reflex again. This was a brand new set with the glued foam. Looking back, just like I said with truck, I do think that the blue was a little bit better of a tire comparatively speaking, but I didn't have any prep, so I'm gonna throw that one on me. So I did what was my next best option, which was a glued foam green reflex that was brand new, never been run. I didn't throw any sauce on it or anything. And that was probably the best the buggy felt throughout that entire day. So I was very, very pleased. Being that it was a green tire, as we got to that later part of the race, definitely got a little bit on the twitchy side, super grabby in the bowl. But for the most part, I was able to save it. But I definitely had to catch it a couple times as it tipped onto two wheels in a couple sections of the track. The third main for buggy was going very, very well. I was in like fifth or sixth, somewhere in that upper half of the field, and I was feeling really good about the car. Unfortunately, I had contact with another driver, which just, I mean, it is what it is. It's off-road racing, but that was unfortunately going to drop me down a little bit. I was able to still hang on to what I think was an 8th overall for that run. So nothing terrible at all, but not the most ideal. Overall though, now we've gone through all of the different racing for the weekend. Looking back on it, now that I've come home, had a chance to reflect on the weekend overall, I was very, very happy with my pace, being that I haven't raced in pretty much a year since the last Motorama, and I've had relatively minimal track time doing work here at the shop, just kind of, you know, keep everything flowing here. I feel like for the prep work that I had, I couldn't have really asked for much better of a weekend. There were definitely a lot of guys in that main that, you know, they race week in and week out, so I wasn't really expecting to be able to go toe-to-toe with them necessarily, but I did want to, of course, be thereabouts, and I feel like I completed that goal pretty well. So for those of you that are wondering, or maybe have the question of if you should try to go to Motorama next year, I do think it's a very well-rounded event. Scotty runs a great show, and the track is always awesome to drive on. And then of course, during your downtime, you've got lots and lots and lots of different options to go out and watch different things, check out different sports, different motorsports, and look at all of the different shows that they have going on. So overall, very happy with my Motorama weekend. I know this is a bit of a long video here going over everything, but I want to thank you guys for joining me on what is effectively my race report for the weekend, and we'll see you in the next one. One thing I did forget to say, I've got my lovely trophies down here. I got 10th and 11th.